Signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People fainting from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world. So, stand up and raise your heads. Or as Bobby McFerrin sings in his 1988 hit, don't worry, be happy. As nice as Bobby McFerrin's catchy lyrics are, it's maybe easier said than done. I know that whenever I am faced with a crisis or a tragedy, my first impulse is not to be happy. And if someone came to me in my moment of greatest anger or sadness or anxiety and said, well, don't worry, just be happy, it might have the opposite effect. We're not exactly wired to respond to adversity with a smile. But maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe that's not exactly what Jesus is implying. Maybe God doesn't expect us to just respond to adversity with an artificial happiness or to pretend something isn't as bad as it really is. Maybe what Jesus is telling us and what God intends for us is to find that true peace and joy where it seems there is none. To see that even when things are at their worst, there is always still joy to be found. That may still sound unrealistic, if not impossible. But in fact, it has happened. There are people throughout history who show that finding joy in adversity is not only possible, but powerful. Biblical figures like Paul, whose letters from prison form writings in the New Testament, or more contemporary examples like Martin Luther King Jr. and his letters from Birmingham jail, which are now widely studied and appropriately revered. Or take an even more contemporary example you may be less familiar with, but whose name you may have heard in the news over the past 10 plus years. Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, anti-corruption activist, and political prisoner. As you may know, any political opposition or critique of the Russian government or its president is not exactly well received. In 2018, Navalny was barred from running for election. In 2020, he was poisoned. And upon returning to Russia in 2021, he was imprisoned. His sentence extended time after time with no end in sight. And while in prison, he wrote diaries that account of his last years, in which he writes with an incredible conviction, an inspiring degree of peace, and also a surprising dose of humor. On March 22nd of 2022, on the day he was sentenced to an additional 9 years in prison, he decided to write down his immediate thoughts and feelings. Because as he says, all year he had been training for situations like that day, developing what he called his prison Zen. He writes in his diary, "I am completely fine. Even my jailer said in the course of a really annoying full strip search, 'You don't look to me to be all that upset. I am really okay. I am writing this not because I am willing myself to keep up a pretense of being carefree and blasé, but because my prison zen has kicked in. This prison zen involved two techniques. He writes, the first is frequently to be found in self-help books. Imagine the worst thing that can happen and accept it. Not for everyone, he says, especially those struggling with mental health, but he says for some, it can be a powerful tool. With some brevity, he writes about a skill that everyone develops in childhood. He said, when you don't get what you want, you throw your hands up, you lay back in the bed, and you cry your eyes out, hoping that eventually your parents will know just how much they made you suffer. And they will cave and apologize. But at that point, it's too late. The damage is permanent. I think we might all be able to relate to that one as kids or as adults. And as a new parent, I look forward to being on the receiving end. And then he writes that the second technique is so old you may roll your eyes heavenward when you hear it. It is religion. It is doable only for believers, but does not demand zealous, fervent prayer by the prison barracks window 3 times a day, a very common phenomenon in prisons. He says, I have always thought and said openly that being a believer makes it easier to live your life and, to an even greater extent, engage in opposition politics. Faith makes life simpler. The initial position for this exercise is the same as for the previous one. You lie in your bunk, looking up at the one above, and ask yourself whether you are a Christian in your heart of hearts. It is not essential for you to believe some old guys in the desert once lived to be 800 years old, or that the sea was literally parted in front of someone. But are you a disciple of the religion whose founder sacrificed himself for others, paying the price for their sins? Do you believe in the immortality of the soul and the rest of that cool stuff? If you can honestly answer yes, what is there left for you to worry about? He continues, my job is to seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and leave it to good old Jesus and the rest of his family to deal with everything else. They won't let me down and will sort out all my headaches. As they say in prison here, they will take my punches for me. That right there is the power of faith. That is where, even in the face of death, peace and joy are to be found. Because when stripped of everything else, he found peace and joy in the one place it always remains. The one source of peace and joy that can stand us up and raise our heads in the face of death. The good news of certain redemption. When he wrote these words, Alexei Navalny knew that he would die in prison. He had accepted that reality, and he was right. He died on February 16th of this year in a prison in Western Siberia. Yet, even still, as he said himself in 2022, he was and is completely fine. Today begins a new church year, and the season of Advent, a season in which we all prepare ourselves in heart and mind for Christ's arrival. But even as lights and trees are going up and shopping is already well underway, Advent is not just about getting ready for Christmas. It's not just about preparing for Christ's first coming. In this first part of Advent especially, it's also about looking ahead to the future, not just to the past. Looking ahead to when Christ will come again. We don't really talk about that second part all that much, maybe because it's hard to think about or discuss in any certain terms something that hasn't happened yet. Maybe because the thought of it actually happening anytime soon is unsettling. Or maybe it's because we like to think the Bible tells the entire finished story. But the story isn't over just yet. We're living in it right now. And so now we can live with the hope that Christ offered in his first coming as we wait still now and prepare to meet Christ face to face. And while Jesus tells us there will be certain signs, as we just heard in Luke, exactly when or how Jesus will return is anyone's guess. Plenty have gotten that prediction wrong already. Some probably thought the pandemic was a sign of the end, just as some thought the Cold War was a sign some many years before, or World War II before that, or World War I, and on and on. Even St. Paul himself, who for all his wisdom and faithfulness seemed to think in his earliest writings that the end would happen at any moment. And since we are all here today, it's safe to say he was a bit off in his prediction, like so many after him. But what is certain is that everyone of every generation has endured challenges. From the communal sufferings that we face together, like wars or famines or plagues, to the personal challenges that we face in our work or our health or our relationships, any of which can seem so awful and so weigh us down that we feel like our lives are falling apart and the end is near. What if, in the face of all of these challenges, we take seriously not only that Christ has died, Christ is risen, but also that Christ will come again? What if, like Paul, MLK, and Navalny before us, we really believe that in the midst of difficult times, when it seems like our world is falling apart, we trust that this isn't the end? That as Jesus says, even as earth and heaven pass away, my words will not pass away. As the legendary singer, songwriter, and former Beatle John Lennon once said, everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Until that wonderful end, our task, the work of being a Christian, is to be on guard, to prepare in how we live right now. Prepare, as our collect says, by casting away the works of darkness and putting on a sense of the armor of light. Prepare by giving time, energy, and resources to wherever God is pulling you. Prepare by holding tight to the hope of salvation and sharing that hope with others. Prepare as if there is no time to waste. And when life seems hardest, prepare all the more and seek that deep peace and joy that stands you up and raises your head. Or in Navalny's words, find your Zen. Yes, through that first strategy, staring in the face of adversity and sometimes accepting the worst of it, but especially through that second strategy. Have faith, that true faith that is at the heart of Advent, the assurance that God came among us to love and to save us from sin and death, that nothing, no matter how awful it is, can go back and change that, and that nothing can stop Christ from coming again and completing the work that he began. Let that faith shape how you live. As Navalny shows us, seek God's kingdom, leave the rest to Jesus. And no matter what happens, however good or bad, whether in life or in death, you will be completely fine.